Now let's talk about the sealing procedures for these different sites. Before sealing begins, it's important to prepare the facility or area to be fumigated. Turn off all ventilation, supply air, air conditioning, and other air-moving systems which could negatively affect your seals. Next, it's important to look for any areas that could be permanently sealed. These would be cracks in walls, roof joints, holes in walls, gaps around piping, and many other areas. Expandable foam or caulking material can work well on these structural flaws. And depending on the circumstances, often these permanent repairs can be addressed during the initial inspection and repaired prior to the day you arrive to begin the fumigation. Any non-temporary seals should be performed by facility maintenance or approved by facility management. Temporary sealing techniques can vary from site to site, but most will include the use of polyethylene sheeting, adhesive tapes, and adhesive sprays to cover and seal vents, doorways, and any other openings where fumigant gas may escape. Now it's time to go over each of our examples to give an overview of how to seal and make other final preparations ahead of the fumigant application. Let's start with our railcar example. You'll begin by gaining access to the hatches atop the railcar. Generally, the supplies you'll need to seal the hatches include, but aren't limited to, tape, spray adhesive, a hard bristled brush, bolt or wire cutters, and poly sheeting. Now remember, workers should not carry these items in their hands, as 3 points of contact are always required when ascending or descending ladders. Develop a safe strategy that allows the workers to locate the supplies onto the railcar while maintaining safety standards that govern working from the height of the railcar top. Sometimes, facilities will have a gangway with standard stairs that allow you to access the top of the railcar without using the railcar ladder. If that's the case, you may be able to omit some of these steps. But now that you're on top of the railcar, you'll need to gain access to the hatches. Use the bolt or wire cutters, as the hatches are usually secured using steel cable ties. Now you'll need to open the hatches. The latches are notoriously stubborn, and for some, the hatch covers can be cumbersome. So work in pairs or as a team, and never use an amount of force that may cause you to lose your balance. And now the hatches are open. You can use the brush to remove any debris or dust that may be on the outer edges of the hatches. Poly sheeting, spray adhesive, and tape will then be used to seal the hatches. If you're planning to use cylinderized phosphine as a fumigant of choice, it can either be applied introducing an application line into the top hatches, or more often, a modified cam lock can be used at ground level. But remember, these application lines will need to be removed, and the entrance point will need to be sealed prior to any transportation of the fumigated vessel. Now, let's discuss sealing for a partial facility fumigation using the tarp stack method. The basic supplies you'll need to seal a tarp are tape, spray adhesive, poly sheeting, and usually a lift or extension ladder to access the top of the stacks. Using the extension ladder or lift, cover the entire stack while remaining in compliance with fall protection standards. Oftentimes, the poly sheeting will need to be taped together to provide a sufficient width of material to ensure an adequate seal. You should also reinforce the poly sheeting on any sharp corners or edges with tape or other means to prevent tearing of the poly. So now that the poly is covering the stacks, it's time to work on the ground seal. Seal the bottom edges of the poly to the ground using your sealing supplies. Often there will be excess poly sheeting that tends to aggregate at the corners or edges of the tarps. So you'll use your sealing materials to seal the corners and any other areas which could allow the fumigant to escape the tarp. Please note that phosphine has a high vapor pressure, so leaving some extra slack in the tarps or poly will allow for the gas to expand and minimize the breaches. During the sealing process, you will also need to set up monitoring lines. And where allowed, insert a test line into the mass of the commodity. The line should be of sufficient length to reach the area in which you will monitor phosphine concentrations in the commodities under the tarp. There are various materials used for test line, but the most common is 1/4-inch polyethylene tubing. It's also a really good idea to have a monitoring line in the ambient fumigated space as well, also known as the airspace. This will help determine when the fumigant has reached equilibrium. And if you're using cylinderized phosphine, placing the application lines should also occur at this time. But please remember, cylinderized phosphine is a liquid under pressure, so the application lines will need to be properly secured to prevent whipping. The lines should also be placed in a manner that restricts direct contact with the commodity or packaging. Now let's move on to sealing an entire facility, which is quite often a laborious endeavor. Warehouses can come in all shapes and sizes and vary widely in both construction materials and volume of sealing opportunities. You'll rely heavily on your previous inspection to ensure that you allow the adequate amount of time ahead of the proposed application time, and to create a checklist of items to seal on final prep day. You'll need to seal any possible leakage point that could allow fumigant to escape from the inside of the structure during the exposure period. Most typically, you'll use poly sheeting, tape, and spray adhesive to seal up overhead or bay doors, personnel doors, and side vents. Overhead doors and some side vents may require the use of a lift or ladder to seal, but often the most challenging aspect of sealing a facility is the roof. Most structures have vents and other items that will need to be sealed on the roof, so the use of a lift or ladder will likely be required. And as always, be sure to adhere to fall protection standards when sealing any item at height. Sometimes you'll need to get creative to ensure that an adequate seal using plastics, tapes, metals, caulks, and other various materials are adequate. The bottom line is, you have to seal the structure well enough to reasonably hold fumigant for the entire exposure period, and as not to create a safety hazard for bystanders or violate the label. And just as with tarps, this is the time to install the monitoring lines into the commodity. The size of the facility will help determine the number of monitoring lines you'll need. Often, multi-floor and heavily compartmentalized facilities will require more monitoring lines to help you determine that the application rate is being achieved in all areas. This will also help you determine where you need to potentially add more fumigant if leakage occurs. Now, where it's allowed, insert a test line into the mass of the commodity again, as well as the predetermined areas in the ambient airspace. Just as with partial facility fumigations, this is the ideal time to install your application lines when using cylinderized phosphine. And because phosphine has such a high vapor pressure, achieving equilibrium in ambient spaces can happen quickly. This is good news, as it may minimize the need for multiple application lines in many fumigations. However, if there's ever a question, especially in a multi-floor or heavily compartmentalized structure, multiple application points will need to be considered. Place the application lines in open areas and direct the flow away from commodities and equipment. Make sure to secure the lines very well to prevent whipping action. Then run the application end out of the staging area and to the exterior of the facility and connect them to the phosphine cylinders or the blending equipment being used to apply the phosphine. With our warehouse sealed and ready for application, we move on to discuss our final example, the grain bin. Sealing a grain bin or silo comes with its own set of challenges and risks. From the outset, we need to point out that there are two very distinct ways of sealing a grain bin for a fumigation. If the conditions allow, you may opt to seal the bin from the outside, where you seal all vents, hatches, and aeration fans with the use of a ladder or existing platform without actually entering the grain bin. The other option is to physically enter the bin and cover the surface of the grain with a plastic tarp and then apply the fumigant under the tarp space. This option comes with a different set of risks than sealing from the outside. Confined space training, engulfment hazards, permitting, and certification should all be addressed well in advance of the fumigation if you choose this option. Sealing from the outside is not free of risk either, as you'll need to employ the appropriate fall protection measures as discussed with the previous example, using lifts or ladders. Use tape, spray adhesive, poly sheeting, or alternate sealing materials to seal the hatches, eave lines, doors, aeration fans, and all other penetrations. And because many grain bins are permanently connected to other bins, elevators, and grain handling machinery, you'll also need to close off and seal all commodity movement lines, such as augers, chutes, and conveyor systems. This includes any that are located in tunnels underneath the bin. You'll want to install monitoring lines according to previous guidance in this module. Monitoring lines should be installed at the top and bottom of the grain bin at a minimum. Because many commodities are dense and the time it takes to achieve equilibrium can take several days, it's a common practice to utilize the J system recirculation system. This method facilitates the quick and uniform penetration of phosphine throughout the commodity. During the sealing process, tubing is run from the top of the bin to the bottom and connected to an external blower on the exterior of the bin. Then, the phosphine gas is drawn out of the headspace and blown into the bottom of the storage using these specifically designed low-volume blowers and ductwork. And if you're using cylinderized phosphine, it's common to introduce the fumigant into the recirculation system and use the blowers to move the fumigant into the grain mass. This is done by injecting the fumigant directly into the tubing used when you install the system. When using cylinderized phosphine without recirculation, you can apply directly into the headspace of the bin or into an opening at the bottom, typically a dryer aeration fan. Just make sure that the introduction point is very well sealed so that no fumigant escapes during the application. Remember, phosphine is a high vapor pressure gas, and cylinderized phosphine can breach seals very easily. especially if the commodity is dense. It takes time for the pressure to equalize, especially without the use of recirculation. There are so many different tips, tricks, and methods that can be used for the sealing of a structure for fumigation that it's nearly impossible to include them all here. We've only covered the basics, but make sure you refer to the labels and manuals of the fumigant you're using for more clarification. Okay, now that our 4 examples are sealed, placarded, and monitoring and introduction lines have been installed, we can move on to the application of the fumigants.